Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbard Gaming. Yeah, I'm jumping straight into it this week. I have another episode of How About That? This time, instead of a game that is sort of technically impressive on some level, I decided I'm going to show you one that is just a great game from a game design standpoint and from a playability standpoint. And that game is the NES version of Life Force, which is a lot better than the arcade version of Life Force, also known as Salamander. So, I can't talk about this game without bringing up the arcade version first, even though this isn't a direct comparison, like some of my other videos. I do have a direct comparison of the arcade versus PC Engine versions that I did years ago if you want to see that, and I'll link that down below, and it'll also be up at the top here somewhere. So anyway, Salamander in the arcade was sort of almost like a side story to the Gradius series, in that it retained a lot of its gameplay elements, but it switched a lot of things up. So in Arcade Salamander, when you picked up power-ups, you got them right away. You didn't have to pick up like the tokens and buy them like you do in Gradius. Now, when they brought Life Force to the NES, they sort of based it on the sort of Japanese update of Salamander, which was called Life Force, which did in fact employ the token system and changed up some of the graphics. Now, the NES version of this game is sort of a mishmash of the arcade versions of both Salamander and Life Force. So as far as the NES game goes, it retains a lot of what was in the arcade one, but obviously it loses out a lot of graphical fidelity that we saw in that version. So on the NES, we lose all the parallax scrolling, things are a lot smaller, and there's a lot more flicker and a lot more slowdown, and you can't have as many options on screen, but it does retain the two-player mode. Now, if you're looking at this and you're thinking, oh, can I have two players and each player have two options? The answer is no. No, you can't. So, it's two players, but you can only have a few options on screen at once total between the both of you. And here we lose out on some of that scaling that is in the arcade version, which I'll show you just a smidge of that at the very end here. It had been a while since I played this game, but I still managed to get through it without really dying. The only time I did use a save state on this one was when I had to answer a phone message that came in that was important. So you may see a little cut towards the end. It was at the, I think somewhere in the 6th level, which is the final level of this game. So, speaking of the levels, if we're talking about Arcade Salamander, it had 6 levels. NES Life Force has 6 levels, but aside from this first level, many of them are very different between the two versions. So this level is almost the same between the two games, it just sort of mixes up the way things are, like, lengthwise a little bit for some of the sections. And Salamander is also way faster than, the arcade Salamander is way faster than this NES version of Life Force. But despite all that, NES Life Force, still a great game, and again, I want to stress from a gameplay and playability standpoint, this is probably the best version of Life Force that there is. And the music actually comes off a little better in this one, probably than even the arcade version. The arcade's FM sound, I mean, it was an early game to have an FM chip in it, and it sounds like an early game to have an FM chip in it. So the level we're looking at now, this is the second level in the NES version of Life Force. In the arcade, we don't see this level until stage 4. So the arcade, the second level is a star field with a bunch of asteroids in it and stuff, which is really kind of plain and boring. On the NES, they axed that one and jumped straight to the second overhead level, which is this one. Now they did slightly modify it, because in the arcade version, when you fire missiles, they fire down into the ground also, and you can hit some installations that launch enemies up out of the floor. Here we lose that, which in the arcade one, it didn't really make sense anyway. And I don't want to keep comparing it to the arcade, because that's not what this video is about. So I'm going to try and focus more on just what this one is versus what it isn't, and what it really changed. I'll still bring it up here and there, but I want to focus on this version. So here we have these volcanoes that spout out a whole bunch of rocks, and you can just blast them and then make them dormant. With the missiles, in this version of the game, we have 2 levels of missile power-ups. When you first get them, they're a little slow. You can get them again to make them faster. And the same applies to the laser here. This does also have the ripple laser from the arcade, but I don't like it, so you'll never see me use it in here. And, I mean, as you can hear, they've done a really nice job with the music in this game. And like I said, I do actually prefer this music to the FM soundtrack of the original game, which is a little rough around the edges, while this one sounds a lot more refined, even though the capabilities of the sound chip are not as good. Now, what is inescapable in this version is all this flicker that we're going to see, and, I mean, it's even a tinge worse in 2-player mode, when everyone's as powered up as can be and you have all the options you can possibly have on screen. It's not a huge difference, but, you know, it's definitely taxing the NES. And this was a pretty early game, so Konami still were able to refine their engine a little bit that they used for these things. And when Gradius 2 for the Famicom was released, it had cleaned up a lot of the slowdown and flicker and stuff that we see in this game, and it manages to throw a little more on screen at one time with less issues. Now, having said that, even with all this, you know, flicker and everything that we see in this version, this is still a great game to play. Now, as a hardcore shmup fan, you may look at this game and just say, hey, you know, who cares about this game? Who cares about this game? It's got barely any on-screen enemies, it's slow, it's easy, why would I waste my time with this? Well, the answer to that one is this game is just fun. The play mechanics are fun. And as far as 8-bit, you know, shmups go, this is probably my all-time favorite when it comes to this style of game. I mean, there's so much it does right, and I wish that more of the 8-bit shooters played like this one does. We have nice big bosses like Intruder coming up here. The design is a little bit different from the arcade version, but that's fine. The play mechanics on this are basically exactly the same. The only thing is, when we fire our nice fully powered up lasers and missiles with our 2 extra options and our force field on, yeah, it creates a ton of slowdown here. As you can see, when you're not firing, the speed of the game dramatically changes and is much faster. And if you're unfamiliar with this game, every other level you alternate between side-scrolling and overhead scrolling. And another thing worth pointing out for this game is it does have the infamous Konami code in here. If you enter it at the title screen, you'll get 30 lives like you would in Contra. And that will apply to both players, so if you're playing 2 players, you'll each have 30 lives. So you should have no problem seeing the end of this game if you really want to play it yourself, and you've never tried it before. Now, you probably won't even need it, because it is very easy, especially by today's standards. I mean, if you're a master of, you know, harder shoot-'em-ups, you're probably not going to have any issues making your way through this one. But, you know, there are things, if you see them for the first time, that, you know, they're probably going to surprise you, and they'll probably kill you once or twice, like these little flame eruptions. You probably knew something was up when you saw all this fire, but maybe not what if you've never seen this game before. And these fire effects, I mean, for a pretty early NES title, were really nice. And when I say early, I mean, this didn't come out at like the dawn of the system, but it was definitely before the system sort of hit its stride and developers were releasing, you know, maybe their 3rd-gen titles, where, like Gradius 2, where things had been improved significantly even from here. And I think, you know, back when this came out, I mean, this was all pretty impressive. I remember being pretty wowed by the flame eruptions here, because I had never even seen Life Force in the arcade or Salamander at the point that I played this. This was the first version of this game I ever played. You know, I knew it was probably going to be good from the fact that it was a Konami game. And I played it at a friend's house, and just on a whim, I said, hey, you know, at the title screen, let me try something. I entered that Konami code and was shocked to see that it actually worked. My friend thought I had done a magic trick, because he had no idea about the Konami code from the prior games, which, you know, it had showed up in Gradius and Contra. In Gradius, you had to do it in-game, and Contra, you did it on the title screen. And this one, it's on the title screen, as in Contra. And very first time I played it, because we both had so many lives, we made it right through to the end very easily. And I still liked it so much that, you know, as soon as I could, I went out and got a copy of this game myself and bought it. Remember back then when it came out brand new, it was $40. Here we have some fun with some option wiggling. Here is our boss here, Cruiser Tetron, which is a little bit bigger than we see in the arcade one, since they went with a different style for him. And we're officially about halfway done. So here is our second overhead level in this game, and this one is completely original. There is no equivalent to this level in any version of the arcade game. So we're talking, it's not in Arcade Salamander or Arcade Life Force. And I also have to say, you know what, this is probably my favorite level in the entire game. What's interesting is the soundtrack in this one. It employs a lot of the music from the arcade game. Some of it you don't hear in the arcade original, but they were unused tracks in the arcade original. So if you have one of the compilation releases, specifically things like the packs that were released on the PSP, it's got a music player for the arcade releases, and you can hear all the unused tracks. And pretty much every song you hear in the NES version that wasn't in Arcade Salamander or Life Force is in the unused track section. And I do believe that this one showed up in the arcade release of Life Force in the 5th level, if I remember right. It's been a little while since I played it, so I'm not 100% sure. But I think it did. If you know in the comments, feel free to put it in there. I just don't have time to check before I release this video. This video is kind of a last-minute deal because I'm putting together, as I've mentioned several times now, a very large one. And it's been taking longer to put together than I would have liked. And I didn't want to rush it and do a bad job on it because it's one of those that will probably be sort of evergreen that people visit every now and then over the years. So I want to make sure I actually get it done and get it done right. As we blow away those things, we move into the next section. Thought it was so cool that some of the enemies in here look like actual blood cells. Remember being in school at the time, I just happened to have a biology class, and we were looking at some of the pictures and textbooks, and I'm like, oh wow, those are the things that are in Life Force! And yeah, they pretty much are. What I would really, really love to see, and I don't have the time or the skill to do this, is for someone to sort of do a version of Life Force, maybe for the Genesis, that incorporates the best of both the arcade and this version. A hybrid of them, either with maybe you select different levels, like you'll have a choice between which level 2 to do, which level 4 to do, and things like that. And if you weren't aware, or even if you are, you can cheese your way through the end of this level, which I will do in a moment here. And I can't even take credit for figuring this out, because this was in one of the game magazines back in the day. I can't remember which one. It was either EGM or Game Players magazine, I think, one of those two, where it just let you know that you could just sit there and not do anything. And yeah, it works. If you hang around at the bottom of the screen, those little shrimp-looking things are invincible. You can't shoot them, you have to avoid them. Makes making it through that ribcage section a lot harder. And we have our nice little skull boss. And we made quick work of him. Here we are on our second to last level. This is another song that appears in the unused tracks in the arcade release of Salamander, if you listen to it, like I said, in one of the compilation versions of the game. This is probably my second favorite level in the NES version. And this one, because of the way the level is designed, I'd say kind of more closely links Life Force and Gradius than the arcade version, of Salamander and Gradius. I mean, NES Life Force feels a lot more like Gradius than the arcade versions of either Salamander or Life Force. And here's me getting a little too scared to get to the bottom there, because I hadn't played this in a while and I didn't want to crash and die. So you'll see a lot of playing it safe in this playthrough. That's another song where I just really liked how this song came out in this version. And we're about to see an NES staple in just a moment here. This particular rock I always thought was kind of funny. I considered it the sequel to the rock from Gradius that was a lot smaller. And this part with all these enemies coming up behind you, I consider that sort of an homage to the 5th level of Arcade Salamander, which is a very plain level. Doesn't even have a, foreground, but it does sure have a ton of enemies going after you. And here's what I was talking about, an NES staple, a bunch of spikes falling from the ceiling in a level. You would see this in many NES games back from this era, even in the NES port of Double Dragon. Now this level is about to shift from its sort of rocky, Gradius-like area to a temple area. And again, there is no equivalent to that section in the arcade releases of Salamander or Life Force either. I always wish you could just blow off the little crystal head of that thing, but you can't. And one other thing I'll note here for this section in particular, I mean, this game predates Thunder Force 2, but this area and the temple level towards the end of Thunder Force 2, for some reason they both remind me of each other. But obviously this one came out a few years earlier. Or I should say, I think it did. I have to go look up and see exactly when this game came out. Thunder Force 2, at least in the US, came out in 1989. This was either 87 or 88, I don't remember offhand. Maybe I'll throw that into the description as soon as I'm done recording this. Yeah, so in this part, you get to play the game of try and avoid picking up the tokens that you don't want. Because generally with this game, once you have your shield and you've got your power-ups to the level you want them on, you want to try and keep the power-up meter at the shield. So if you take a couple of stray hits and your shield dissolves, you can enable it again immediately. And here you can see I am no longer in a position to do that, because I was forced to pick up some of those power-ups even though I didn't want them. and I was always annoyed that it takes so long for this boss fight to start. Anyway, I'm kind of glad that I thought of doing this game today, because I don't do a whole lot of NES stuff on here. I do every now and then. I don't want anyone to have the impression that I don't like the NES. Like most kids in America in the mid-80s, I mean, this was the main game system I played back at that time. I got a Sega Master System a little bit later, just a year or two after, I don't remember which. But the NES, I mean, this had all the big games, and this was the thing I spent the most time on when, you know, I was a kid, like in the between 12 and 13 or so. So I'm pretty sure I got the NES one year, Sega Master System the next year, and then the Genesis the year after that, if I remember right. And no, I wasn't some spoiled rich kid. I just had, you know, a big family and older siblings who were older enough than me that they could buy their own stuff. And the way I would get things a lot back then is my older brother liked games, and he would buy stuff both for us or for himself, and we were usually allowed to play it. So here is our final level. Always hated these stupid little bubble enemies. Love how they fire shots that are basically the same size as them. And while it's not too hard here, if you want to see how mean they can make this level, check out the arcade version. You can see that again in my comparison of the arcade and PC Engine ports. Things are pretty significantly cut back here on NES. But again, I mean, I think in large part it's better for it. The arcade and PC Engine versions are a little over-the-top difficulty-wise in this section, especially the arcade release. You may be wondering, when you die in this version of the game on NES, do you go to a checkpoint, or do you just respawn, you know, where you are? And the answer is, you just respawn where you are. Here we are getting ready to approach the next section. So we'll have them Y-heads coming up here. In the arcade one, they famously jump around at you and turn around and face the other way. On the NES, we don't really have that. Most of them are stationary, but you will see an exception to that in just a moment here. Yeah, they do manage to fire off a pretty impressive amount of shots. And as we get into the next area here, we're sort of approaching the end game now. There's one of the leaping ones. They have to make sure that only one of them is primarily on screen at once, which is why they're spaced so far apart. And then we go back to a few stationary ones. And now we are approaching the game's final boss. So this is sort of the core or heart of Zelos. And this game is supposed to mainly take place inside of the creature. And we really see that in the arcade version of Life Force. Not so much Salamander, but Life Force, they make it very clear and plain that you are inside a thing. So in the arcade original, when this thing's approaching, you just blast it, you know, basically in that sort of eyeball thing until it's gone. In the NES one, they add sort of that little dragon thing that goes around it at first. And then we have our final section of the game, which is a high-speed escape while bars close in behind you. It's a little tough to make it through this part without dying, I'll warn you about that. So, if you get up to this part and you have less than probably 3 lives left, you may just want to restart the level. But as you'll see, you can make it without dying. Your force field does nothing for you here. If any of these bars touch you, you die immediately. And then once you get out of that beginning part where you have to sort of move around just a little tiny bit, you can just kind of sit in the center, just a little left of center, and then you'll make it all the way through without dying. And then we have our lovely single cutscene where the planet explodes. And then we just get to continue listening to the ending theme music. So, that's pretty much it. That is Life Force on the NES. Now what I'm going to show you next, for just the final minute or two while I close this video out, I'll show you some scenes where I compare similar levels between the NES version and the arcade original Salamander. The reason I'm showing Salamander in this comparison instead of arcade Life Force is, as I mentioned way at the beginning of this video, the visuals are clearly based on Salamander and not Life Force. While the games are extremely similar, the levels are basically the same, Life Force in the arcade is basically a complete reskin of arcade Salamander that looks much different, and they changed some of the music tracks in it too. So, get ready to see that just for a minute or two, and then we'll close this out. Alright, so here we are with a quick little comparison of a few scenes from both the arcade original Salamander and the NES version of Life Force. And as you can see, yeah, the visuals are a little downgraded on the NES version like I talked about, but it actually looks pretty good. In some places, the contrast on the color actually looks a little bit nicer on NES, I think. It's a shame that some of the backgrounds are completely cut out and removed in areas like this one, but, you know, just, they were dealing with technical limitations. Like I said, despite all the graphical downgrades we're seeing here, NES Life Force, when it comes to playability, I would say is still the better game. I wish it was a smidge faster. Maybe they could have had the background scrolling at the same speed as the arcade foreground. Rather, it's closer to the arcade background, which just makes the levels sometimes seem like they drag on for a little bit. And here I'm comparing levels 4 from the arcade and level 2 from the NES version because, well, they're the same level, just occurs in different places in the game. And this is the boss in the arcade version for Stage 4. On NES, this is just the gate to get to the boss of Stage 2. And the last level I'm going to really show you here, just to, wrap this up, is this fire level. Just so you can get an idea, and you can see they did a pretty good job on this. This is very well done on the NES. So yeah, if you missed NES Life Force, if you weren't around when this game was new, it's definitely worth playing today. It's great if you want just sort of a casual shoot 'em up that you can play and not constantly have to worry about getting completely overpowered and getting destroyed by legions of enemies. This is not a bullet hell game. The hardware wasn't capable of a bullet hell game. Instead, it just produced a fun shoot 'em up that stands at the top of the genre in its class of systems. And now I think it's time to close out this video. So, tell me what you thought of NES Life Force, or what you thought of it compared to the arcade game. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. So that'll do it for this video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like and share it online somewhere. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss one of my videos. If you've got the urge and the means, feel free to support the crazy work that I do here on either Patreon or Ko-fi. Links follow at the end of the video and are down in the description. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.